If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have said my life was perfect. My name's Mark, and for 8 years, I thought I had it all figured out. A thriving business I built from scratch, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a marriage to Elena, a woman I adored. We were the kind of couple people envied. Elena was everything I admired, ambitious, smart, and charismatic. She worked as a marketing manager at a well-known firm, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life. Together, we were a team. In the early days of our marriage, we were unstoppable. We supported each other through thick and thin, celebrating each success and weathering every setback. I'd be up late tweaking a presentation for a big client, and Elena would bring me coffee, her encouragement lifting me just when I needed it. She'd come home after a grueling day at work, and I'd have dinner waiting, eager to hear about her battles with corporate politics. But somewhere along the way, that balance shifted. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Elena's job, which had always been demanding, became all-consuming. She started working longer hours, attending more events, and spending less time at home. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, we were both ambitious, and I admired her dedication. But the cracks started to show when she began mentioning her coworker, Victor. At first, it was casual, just stories about office dynamics or funny anecdotes from team meetings. "Victor said the funniest thing today," she'd tell me, laughing as she recounted some inside joke. I didn't think much of it. Everyone needs friends at work, and Victor seemed harmless. Or so I thought. Victor's name started cropping up more and more. He wasn't just a coworker anymore. He was brilliant, dynamic, a natural leader. Elena talked about him with a sparkle in her eye that I hadn't seen in a while, and it made me uneasy. One night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, smiled, and quickly set it face down on the coffee table. I noticed the name flashing on the screen. Victor. "What's that about?" I asked casually. "Oh, just work stuff," she replied, brushing it off. I didn't push it. Maybe I should have. Looking back, there were other signs I ignored. Elena started dressing differently, sleek, tailored outfits that screamed power and confidence. She began spending more time on her appearance, even on days when she didn't have any meetings. "You look nice," I said one morning as she adjusted her blazer in the mirror. "Thanks," she replied, her tone light but distant. "Just trying to keep up in the office." I told myself it was nothing, that she was just embracing her role. But deep down, a part of me wondered if she was dressing up for someone else. Our conversations at home grew shorter, more surface level. I'd ask about her day, and she'd respond with vague answers before changing the subject. When I brought up how little time we were spending together, she'd wave it off. "Mark, I'm just busy," she'd say. "This is an important time for me at work. You understand, right?" I nodded, pretending I did. But the truth was, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. The worst part wasn't the distance. It was the doubt. I trusted Elena. I had to. We'd built a life together, and I couldn't imagine her jeopardizing that for anything. But Victor's presence loomed over everything, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I told myself I was overthinking, that my insecurities were getting the better of me. But the feeling didn't go away. As I sit here now, recounting how it all started, I can see the signs so clearly. The missed dinners, the late nights, the guarded phone conversations, they were all pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I wanted to believe in us, in the life we'd built. But life has a way of forcing you to confront the truth, whether you're ready for it or not. And the truth? It was about to hit me harder than I ever imagined. Victor. Even now, the name leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. He wasn't just a name anymore. He was a presence, a shadow looming over my marriage, a force I didn't invite but could no longer ignore. The first time I heard about him, it was harmless enough. Elena came home one evening, kicking off her heels as she launched into one of her usual rants about work. She mentioned Victor casually, like he was just another coworker in the background. "He's new to the team," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Very sharp, though. He's already made a name for himself with the higher-ups." I nodded along, not thinking much of it. I was used to Elena talking about work, her colleagues, the never-ending politics of her corporate world. But Victor's name began to pop up more and more in ways I couldn't quite dismiss. Elena started talking about Victor as if he were some kind of workplace savior. "Victor had this great idea during today's meeting," she'd say. "He really knows how to motivate people. Victor managed to close that tough account everyone was struggling with. He's brilliant." At first, I chalked it up to professional admiration. Everyone has that one coworker who stands out, someone who makes the job easier or inspires others. But something about the way she spoke about him made me uneasy. It wasn't just admiration. It was enthusiasm, a kind of energy I hadn't seen from her in a while. The unease deepened when Victor began to creep into our personal life. Elena would mention him during dinner or while we were watching TV, sometimes laughing at his jokes or recounting stories about his bold personality. "He's just so confident," she said one evening, almost wistfully. "Confident how?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Oh, you know, the way he carries himself," she replied, shrugging. "He's the kind of guy who walks into a room and owns it." I didn't say anything, but the words lingered. Confidence, boldness. I could feel the comparisons she wasn't saying aloud, the unspoken contrast between Victor and me. The first real crack appeared when Victor started texting her outside of work. It started small, quick questions about projects or team updates. But soon it became more frequent. Her phone would buzz late in the evening, and she'd pick it up with a faint smile, typing back quickly before setting it down again. "Who's that?" I asked one night, trying to sound casual. "Just Victor," she said, her tone dismissive. He needed clarification on something for tomorrow. I nodded, but a knot tightened in my stomach. Why did he need to message her so late? Wasn't this something that could wait until morning? The shift became more obvious when Elena started changing her routine. She began leaving earlier for work, saying she needed to prep for meetings. She stayed later, claiming her team was under pressure to meet deadlines. "You've been working a lot lately," I said one evening as she walked through the door exhausted. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, it's just a busy time," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "Victor's really pushing us to excel, and I don't want to fall behind." There it was again. Victor. Always Victor. Then came the work events. Elena had never been a fan of networking parties or after-hours gatherings, but now she seemed eager to attend them, often at Victor's suggestion. "Do you want me to come with you?" I asked one evening as she was getting ready for another event. She hesitated. "It's mostly work people," she said. "You'd probably be bored." I didn't argue, but the rejection stung. The final straw came when I noticed her buying new outfits. Not just casual clothes, but sleek, tailored pieces that were clearly meant to impress. "You've been dressing up a lot lately," I remarked, trying to sound nonchalant. She laughed, brushing it off. "It's just for work. You know how competitive my office is. First impressions matter." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Was it really about work? Or was it about Victor? Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. Victor wasn't just a coworker. He was a catalyst, a presence that was pulling Elena further and further away from me. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. The signs were there, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. Elena wasn't just working late or dressing up for the office. Something had shifted between us, something unspoken but undeniable. I tried to rationalize it. Her career was demanding, and she'd always been ambitious. But the more I thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at me. It wasn't just about Victor anymore. It was about what he represented. The growing distance between us, the way Elena's attention seemed to drift further away from our life together. The first major red flag came one evening when I glanced at her phone and saw a notification pop up from Victor. The message was brief, just a string of laughing emojis and a single word: unforgettable. "What's this about?" I asked, holding up her phone. Elena's face shifted, a mix of surprise and defensiveness. "It's nothing," she said quickly, snatching the phone from my hand. "We were joking about a meeting earlier. Don't overthink it." Her dismissive tone stung, but I didn't press further. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I trusted her, or at least I wanted to. But the little things kept piling up. Her late nights at the office turned into full weekends spent catching up on work. When I suggested we plan a weekend getaway to reconnect, she hesitated. "I can't right now," she said, her voice apologetic but firm. "Victor's pushing the team hard this quarter. If I don't keep up, I'll fall behind." I stared at her, trying to hide my frustration. "It's just one weekend, Elena. Can't the work wait?" She sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't understand, Mark. It's not just about the work. It's about showing I can handle the pressure, that I'm committed." Committed. The word hung in the air like a challenge, and I couldn't help but wonder where her real commitment lay. Things came to a head at a corporate gala her company hosted. Elena insisted I come along, saying it would be good for us to make an appearance as a couple. I agreed, hoping it might help bridge the growing gap between us. The evening started off well enough. Elena looked stunning in a deep blue dress, and for a moment, I felt like we were back in sync. But that feeling didn't last. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but notice how much time she spent talking to Victor. It wasn't just the way they stood so close or the way she laughed at his jokes. It was the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. And the way she looked back? It made my stomach churn. Later that evening, I tried to bring it up. "You and Victor seemed pretty cozy tonight," I said as we drove home. Elena frowned, glancing at me. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means he was staring at you like you hung the moon," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. She rolled her eyes. "Mark, he's my coworker. That's it. Stop making something out of nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and we both knew it. Even our friends started noticing the tension. Josh, my best friend, pulled me aside one afternoon while we were grabbing drinks. "What's going on with you and Elena?" he asked, his tone cautious but concerned. I hesitated, unsure how much to say. "It's complicated." Josh raised an eyebrow. "Does this have anything to do with that Victor guy she keeps talking about?" I froze, my grip tightening around my glass. "What do you mean?" "Just that she brings him up a lot," Josh said. "You know, when we're all hanging out. It's like she can't stop talking about him." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. If even our friends were noticing, how could I keep pretending everything was fine? The final straw came when I overheard a phone call between Elena and Victor late one night. I'd woken up thirsty and was heading to the kitchen when I heard her voice, low and hushed, coming from the living room. "No, I can't. Mark's here," she said, her tone clipped but soft. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "I know," she continued, sighing. "But it's complicated. I'll figure it out, okay?" I didn't need to hear more. The trust I'd been clinging to was gone, shattered in an instant. Looking back, I realized I was holding on to a version of Elena that no longer existed. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. And Victor? He wasn't just a coworker. He was a wedge, driving us further and further apart. The question wasn't whether something was happening, it was what I was going to do about it. The night it all came crashing down is burned into my memory. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, a quiet dinner at home after a long day. But something about Elena's demeanor that night felt different. She was more distracted than usual, her eyes flicking to her phone every few minutes, her replies to my questions short and clipped. Everything okay? I asked as we sat at the table, the sound of our utensils on the plates filling the silence. Yeah, she said quickly, too quickly. Just a busy day at work. I didn't push further. I'd learned that pressing her about work only led to arguments, and I was too tired for another fight. Later that evening, Elena said she had to go back to the office. Victor needs me to review some last-minute changes for tomorrow's presentation, she explained, grabbing her bag. I froze. Victor. Of course, it was Victor. Do you really need to go now? I asked, my voice calm but tight. Yes, she said, avoiding my gaze. It's important. I watched her walk out the door, a sense of unease settling over me like a heavy blanket. Something about her urgency didn't sit right. And then it hit me. If it was so urgent, why hadn't she mentioned it during dinner? For the first time in our marriage, I felt the need to follow her. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. Her office wasn't far, and I told myself I was being paranoid. But as I pulled into the parking lot and saw her car parked in its usual spot, my suspicions grew. The building was mostly dark, except for a few lights on the upper floors. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached her floor, I paused outside the door to her office suite, taking a moment to collect myself. And that's when I heard it. Laughter, hers and another man's. I pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. The sound of their voices grew louder as I approached her office. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were just working. Maybe I was overreacting. But when I reached the doorway and looked inside, all those possibilities shattered. There they were, Elena and Victor. She was sitting on her desk, her legs crossed, leaning toward him with a playful smile on her face. Victor stood close, too close, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. Their conversation was casual, their laughter easy, but the way they looked at each other was anything but professional. I cleared my throat, and they both froze. Mark? Elena said, her voice laced with shock. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, I replied, my tone cold. Victor, ever the smug bastard, didn't even flinch. We're just working, he said, flashing me a grin that made my blood boil. You know how demanding this job can be. I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on him. Working? Is that what you call this? Elena stood up, her hands raised defensively. Mark, please don't make this into something it's not. I ignored her, my focus still on Victor. You've been crossing lines for months, haven't you? And now you have the audacity to act like this is normal? Victor shrugged, his arrogance infuriating. You're overreacting. Elena and I have a connection, sure, but it's nothing serious. That was it. The last straw. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed Victor by the collar and shoved him against the wall. His smug grin vanished as he realized I wasn't playing games. Let me make one thing clear, I said through gritted teeth. You don't come near my wife again. You don't text her, you don't call her, you don't so much as look at her. Victor stammered, trying to regain his composure. Mark, calm down. This isn't... I didn't let him finish. My fist connected with his jaw, and he crumpled to the floor. Elena screamed, rushing to Victor's side as I stepped back, my chest heaving. Mark, what are you doing? She cried, her voice filled with a mix of anger and panic. I looked at her, the woman I had once trusted more than anyone in the world, and felt nothing but betrayal. I'm doing what I should have done months ago, I said, turning to leave. You made your choice, Elena. Now I'm making mine. As I walked out of the office building, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. The truth was out, the facade shattered. There was no going back now, and honestly, I didn't want to. I didn't remember driving home that night. My mind was a blur of emotions, rage, betrayal, and a strange, numbing clarity. The image of Victor sprawled on the floor, clutching his jaw, kept replaying in my mind. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I didn't regret it either. Some things needed to be said, and sometimes words weren't enough. When I walked through the front door, the house felt eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, making it hard to breathe. I stood in the foyer for a moment, staring at the picture frames on the wall, smiling photos of Elena and me, snapshots of a life that now felt like a lie. I headed straight for the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and sat at the table. My hand shook slightly as I raised the glass to my lips, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through me. Elena came home about an hour later. I heard the door open, her hurried footsteps, and then the sound of her bag hitting the floor. She found me in the kitchen, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mix of anger and fear. "What the hell was that, Mark?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I looked at her, calm on the outside but burning on the inside. "What was what, Elena? The part where your coworker had his hands all over you? Or the part where I reminded him that there are consequences for disrespecting another man's marriage?" She threw up her hands, pacing the room. "You didn't have to hit him. Do you realize what you've done? He could press charges, Mark. You could lose everything." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Lose everything? Don't you think I already have? I trusted you, Elena. I trusted us. And you threw it all away. For what? For him?" Her expression softened, her shoulders sagging. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this wasn't what it looked like. You've been lying to me for months, haven't you? Late nights, secret texts, the excuses. It's all been about him." She sank into the chair across from me, tears welling in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "Victor, he was there, and I was feeling lost. I didn't know how to talk to you about it." "Lost?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You were lost, so you decided to find yourself in the arms of another man? That's your excuse?" The argument spiraled from there. Every bottled-up frustration, every moment of doubt came pouring out. She tried to explain herself, to justify her actions, but every word only deepened the wound. "You don't understand," she said at one point, her voice breaking. "I've been struggling, Mark. You've been so busy with work, with your own life, and I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I scoffed. "So your solution was to make yourself visible to him? To let him walk into our marriage and take what didn't belong to him? Or to you?" She flinched at my words, but I didn't stop. "You didn't even try to fix this, Elena. You didn't come to me. You didn't fight for us. You just gave up and let him fill the gap." By the time the argument ended, we were both exhausted, our words drained of emotion. She sat there in silence, tears streaming down her face, while I stared at the wall, my jaw clenched. "I need space," I said finally, my voice flat. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm leaving," I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. "You've made your choices, Elena. Now I need to make mine." I packed a bag that night and drove to my best friend Josh's place. He didn't ask questions, just opened the door and handed me a beer. "You want to talk about it?" he asked after a while. "Not yet," I replied, sinking into his couch. "Fair enough," he said, sitting down beside me. "But just know, whatever it is, you're not alone, man." His words hit harder than I expected, and for the first time that night, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had walked out of my own home, left the woman I had loved for years, and taken the first step into an uncertain future. But for the first time in a long time, I also felt free. Free to think, to feel, and to figure out what came next. The first night away from home felt strange, like I'd been ripped out of my own life and dropped into someone else's. The couch at Josh's place was comfortable enough, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elna and Victor in that office. Her laughter, his smirk. The way they acted like I didn't exist, like what they were doing didn't matter. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought it would. It wasn't just about the kiss, or whatever else might have happened. It was about the years we had spent together, the trust I had placed in her, the life we had built. And now, it all felt meaningless. Josh, ever the loyal friend, gave me space when I needed it but didn't let me wallow for too long. The next morning, he handed me a cup of coffee and sat across from me, his expression serious. "You've got to figure out what you're going to do, man," he said. "You can't let this tear you apart." "I know," I muttered, staring into the dark liquid in my mug. I don't know where to start." Josh leaned back, crossing his arms. "Start by deciding what you want. Do you want to try and fix things? Or are you done?" The question lingered in the air. I wanted to scream that I was done, that I could never forgive her for what she had done. But the truth was, a part of me still clung to the idea of us, of what we used to be. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Then figure it out," Josh said. "But don't let her guilt you into a decision. You've got to do what's right for you." Meanwhile, Elena was relentless. She called and texted constantly, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and desperate pleas. "Mark, please talk to me," one message began. "I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I still love you. Don't throw everything away because of one mistake." One mistake. The phrase made my blood boil every time I heard it. She didn't get to dismiss what she had done as a single lapse in judgment. It was a choice, a series of choices that had led us here. I didn't respond to her messages, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't trust myself to say it calmly. The fallout wasn't just emotional. It was social, too. Word of the incident spread quickly, as things like this often do. Angela, my sister, called me one evening with an update I didn't ask for. "People are talking, Mark," she said, her tone a mix of concern and indignation. "Everyone's got their own version of what happened. Some are siding with you, but others, well, you know how people are." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "What are they saying?" "Some are saying you overreacted," she admitted, "that you shouldn't have hit Victor. But most people think he got what he deserved. And as for Elena," she trailed off, but I could guess the rest. "She's feeling it, isn't she?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Angela hesitated, then said, "Yeah. Her friends are pulling away, and people at work are starting to talk. Victor's reputation isn't exactly helping her case." Hearing that didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. If anything, it made me sad. Sad for the life we had built, for the woman I thought I knew, for the version of us that I had clung to for so long. At Josh's insistence, I started seeing a therapist. At first, it felt strange, sitting in a room with a stranger and spilling my deepest thoughts. But Dr. Patel had a way of cutting through the chaos in my mind. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked during our first session. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to stop feeling this anger, this emptiness." She nodded, her expression calm and understanding. "That's a good place to start. Let's figure out what's at the root of those feelings." Day by day, I began to piece myself back together. I started running in the mornings, letting the rhythm of my footsteps drown out my thoughts. I spent more time with Josh and Angela, leaning on them in ways I hadn't before. But most importantly, I started to rediscover who I was, outside of my marriage, outside of the betrayal. Elena's messages continued, each one more desperate than the last. But I didn't answer. Not yet, I wasn't ready, because this time, the decision had to be mine. and I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, dictate how my story moved forward. News travels fast, and when your marriage is falling apart in spectacular fashion, it spreads even faster. Within days, our friends and family seemed to have formed a council of opinionated judges, each with their own take on what had happened. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. Josh, my best friend, stood firmly in my corner. "Mark, you're better off without her," he said one evening as we sat on his back porch. "If she can't see what she had, that's on her. And don't even get me started on Victor. That guy's got slime ball written all over him." His loyalty was comforting, but it didn't erase the ache of betrayal. On the other side of the spectrum was Elena's sister, Rachel. She called me not long after I'd moved out, her voice a mix of frustration and desperation. "Mark, you've got to talk to her," she insisted. "She's a wreck. She knows she messed up, but you're not even giving her a chance to explain." "She's had plenty of chances," I replied coldly. "She made her choices. Now she has to live with them." Rachel sighed, her tone softening. "Look, I'm not excusing what she did. But people make mistakes. You've been together for years. Doesn't that count for something?" "Not when she threw it away for someone like Victor," I said firmly. "She didn't just make a mistake, Rachel. She betrayed me, betrayed us." Rachel had no response to that, and the call ended in awkward silence. The real chaos, though, came from our mutual friends. Some reached out to express their support, while others tiptoed around the issue, clearly unsure of which side to take. Kate, a friend we'd both known for years, cornered me at a party Josh dragged me to. "Mark, I just want to say I'm sorry for what you're going through," she began, her voice cautious. "Thanks, Kate," I said, taking a sip of my drink. "But," she continued, and I knew where this was going, "don't you think hitting Victor was a bit much?" I set my glass down and fixed her with a steady gaze. "Kate, if you walked into your kitchen and found someone kissing your husband, what would you do?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, her cheeks turning pink. "Fair point," she muttered, retreating into the crowd. Meanwhile, Angela, my sister, went on a one-woman crusade to defend my honor. "Mark doesn't need this drama," she told anyone who dared to question my actions. "Elena and Victor crossed a line, and Mark did what anyone would have done. If you think otherwise, maybe you should ask yourself how you'd react in his shoes." Her fiery loyalty was both heartwarming and slightly terrifying. Even at work, whispers followed me. Coworkers who'd once been friendly now avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. A few, however, approached me with quiet solidarity. "Hey, man," said Brian, one of the project managers during a coffee break. "I heard what happened. That guy had it coming. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I nodded, grateful for the support, even if it didn't ease the heaviness in my chest. Elena, for her part, was facing her own fallout. Angela kept me updated on the social ripple effects, not that I asked. "She's losing friends left and right," Angela said one evening over the phone. "People are starting to realize how shady Victor is, and now they're questioning why she let him get so close in the first place." "Good," I replied, though the satisfaction I thought I'd feel was absent. The divide among our friends and family only added to the weight of everything. Everyone had an opinion, but none of them had lived it. They hadn't seen the texts, heard the whispers, or felt the gut punch of betrayal. Josh was right about one thing, though. At the end of the day, it's your life, Mark, not theirs. Don't let their opinions decide what you do next. He was right. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. When Elena reached out again, it wasn't through texts or calls. It was an email. Formal, almost detached. The subject line simply read, "Can we talk?" For a moment, I stared at the screen, debating whether to even open it. I had ignored her previous messages, each one more desperate than the last, but this one felt different. It wasn't pleading or emotional. It was calculated, like she'd spent hours crafting it. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. "Mark, I know you have every reason to hate me right now, and I don't blame you. But I need to see you. Just once. I need to explain face to face. Please, just give me that chance. Elena. I closed my laptop, frustration bubbling under the surface. What more was there to say? She had made her choices. I had seen enough. Still, the email lingered in my mind. Against my instincts, I agreed to meet her. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted closure. Answers to questions I couldn't shake. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral territory where emotions could hopefully stay in check. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting at a corner table, fidgeting with her coffee cup. She looked tired, worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. "Mark," she said as I sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elena," I replied curtly, leaning back in my chair. "You wanted to talk. So, talk." She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she set her cup down. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About everything, about us, about what I did." "Good," I said, my tone flat. "Because I've been thinking about it too." Her eyes filled with tears, but I refused to let my guard down. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't know why I let things get as far as they did," she admitted. "At first it was harmless. Victor was charming, and I thought it was just a work friendship. But then..." She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "But then you let it become something more." I finished for her, my voice colder than I intended. She nodded, tears spilling over. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. I swear I didn't. I was just... I don't know. Lonely, lost. I felt like we were drifting apart, and Victor was there, paying attention in a way I hadn't felt in so long." Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. "And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix what was broken, you turned to him," I said. "You chose him over us." She flinched at my words, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "It wasn't like that. I never stopped loving you, Mark. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Elena, this wasn't a one-time slip-up. This was months of lying, of hiding things. You didn't make a mistake. You made a series of choices, and each one took you further away from me." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. People around us glanced over, but I didn't care. I waited, letting her cry until she finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm so sorry." I stared at her, the woman I had once trusted with everything, and felt an ache in my chest. Not pity, not anger, just a hollow sadness for what we had lost. "You're right," I said finally. "You don't deserve my forgiveness, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to give it to you. But I'll tell you this. I'm done. Done with the lies, the betrayal, the pain. Whatever we had, it's gone. And I'm not going to keep hurting myself trying to hold on to it." She nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted you to know how much I regret everything." I stood up, throwing a few bills on the table to cover the coffee I hadn't touched. "I hope you figure things out, Elena, but it won't be with me." As I walked out of that coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, relief, and a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Closure didn't come in the way I expected, but it came nonetheless. And now, for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally move forward. When I walked out of that coffee shop, I thought it was over. I thought I'd finally closed the chapter on Elena and everything we had once shared. But life has a way of throwing in a few final twists before letting you move on completely. Elena's professional life began to crumble shortly after. Victor, the same man who had wormed his way into her life and our marriage, showed his true colors. Word spread through her office that he had crossed boundaries with other women, using his charm and position to manipulate those around him. He wasn't just a charismatic coworker. He was a predator, and Elena had been one of his many targets. I learned about it through Angela, who seemed to have a pipeline to all the latest gossip. She called me one evening, her voice a mix of indignation and pity. "Mark, have you heard what's happening with Elena?" she asked, skipping over any pleasantries. "No," I said flatly, not entirely sure I wanted to. "Well, Victor's been outed. A couple of women came forward saying he's been inappropriate for months. HR's launched an investigation, and from what I hear, it's not looking good for him. But here's the kicker. People are dragging Elena into it too." "Dragging her in how?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "Some of the rumors are about her," Angela said hesitantly. "Apparently, Victor's been telling people that whatever they had was mutual, and now Elena's credibility is shot." I sat there, letting her words sink in. On some level, I wasn't surprised. Victor had always been a snake, and it made sense that he would try to save himself by throwing Elena under the bus. Still, hearing it didn't bring me any satisfaction. If anything, it just deepened the ache of everything we had lost. A few days later, Elena reached out again. This time, it wasn't an apology or a plea for reconciliation. It was a quiet, resigned message. "I wanted you to know Victor's been fired. And I'm leaving the company too. I can't stay there anymore, not after everything." I stared at the text for a long moment before replying. "I'm sorry you're going through this. But you made your choices, Elena. I hope you find a way to move forward." Her response came almost immediately. "I'm trying. I really am, thank you." Hearing about her struggles didn't give me the closure I thought it might. It didn't erase the pain or validate my anger. Instead, it left me with a strange sense of pity, not for the woman who had hurt me, but for the person she had become. A part of me wondered if she even recognized herself anymore. Victor's betrayal had exposed the cracks in her own life, and now she was left to pick up the pieces, alone. It was a fate she had chosen, whether she realized it or not. For me, the fallout felt different. While Elena's world seemed to be crumbling, I was slowly rebuilding mine. I wasn't the same person I had been before all of this, but maybe that was a good thing. I was stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to never let anyone undermine my worth again. The scars were still there, of course. Betrayal leaves a mark no matter how much time passes. But those scars weren't just reminders of what I had lost. They were proof of what I had survived. And that, I realized, was enough. The day I finalized the divorce, I expected to feel empty, like a chapter of my life had been torn out and left me with nothing but blank pages. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though I had been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was there. Walking out of the courthouse, I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and for the first time in months, I felt free. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy. At first, the silence in my new apartment was deafening. The walls seemed to echo with memories of Elena, the sound of her laugh, the way she hummed while cooking, even the arguments that used to fill the gaps between us. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to fill that silence with something new. Myself. Josh had been right when he said I needed to rediscover who I was. For so long, my identity had been tied to being Elena's husband, to being part of a perfect couple. Now I was just Mark, and that was enough. I threw myself into things I had neglected for years. I started running every morning, letting the rhythm of my footsteps and the crisp dawn air clear my mind. I picked up an old guitar that had been gathering dust in the corner, fumbling through chords until music filled the room again. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in ages, going to trivia nights and backyard barbecues that reminded me what it felt like to laugh without reservation. But the biggest change came when I joined a hiking group. Josh had dragged me to one of their meetups, insisting that I needed to get out of my apartment and into the world. At first, I was skeptical, but standing at the top of a mountain, looking out over miles of rolling hills, I felt something stir inside me, a spark of life I hadn't realized was missing. It was during one of those hikes that I met Emily. She wasn't flashy or loud. She didn't demand attention or try to impress anyone. She was simply kind. A teacher who loved nature and spent her weekends exploring trails and painting landscapes. Our conversation started over a shared laugh about slipping on a muddy path, and before I knew it, we were talking about everything from books to travel to the meaning of happiness. With Emily, there was no pretense, no games. She didn't try to fill the gaps Elena had left. She simply showed me that life could move forward, one step at a time. As I sat on my balcony one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on everything that had brought me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger. It had all shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was more than what had happened to me. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Meeting Emily didn't erase the past, but it reminded me that the future was mine to create. And as I sat there, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on my face, I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. And that, I thought, was the beginning of something beautiful.